Validity in Interpretation. Hirsch stands as a seminal work in the field of hermeneutics, challenging prevailing trends in literary criticism that privilege subjective interpretation and relativism. Hirsch's central thesis is that the author's original intent is the only legitimate foundation for valid interpretation, a contention that sparked considerable debate and reshaped discussions about the nature of meaning in texts. At a time when new criticism dominated Anglo-American literary studies, emphasizing close reading and the autonomy of the text, and continental theories leaned toward existential and phenomenological approaches, Hirsch's intervention sought to recenter the author as the arbiter of meaning. His arguments, grounded in a rigorous philosophical framework, aim to establish objective criteria for interpretation, countering the notion that texts inherently support multiple, equally valid meanings. Hirsch begins by distinguishing between meaning and significance, a dichotomy central to his argument. For Hirsch, meaning refers to the author's consciously willed intention at the time of the text's creation. It is fixed, determinate, and recoverable through methodological rigor. Significance, by contrast, encompasses the evolving relationships between the text's fixed meaning and various contexts, readers, or historical moments. While significance is mutable and open to endless reinterpretation, meaning remains anchored to the author's intent. This distinction allows Hirsch to argue that while readers may derive personal or culturally specific significances from a text, these do not alter its original meaning. Validity, therefore, hinges on the interpreter's ability to reconstruct the author's intent, a process that demands historical and philological precision. A key component of Hirsch's framework is his reconceptualization of the hermeneutics circle, a concept traditionally associated with Friedrich Schleiermacher and Wilhelm Dilthey. The hermeneutics circle describes the iterative process by which interpreters move between understanding the whole text and its individual parts, each informing the other. Hirsch, however, injects this idea with an emphasis on authorial intent as the stabilizing force. He argues that while the circularity of interpretation might suggest infinite regress or subjectivity, the author's intention acts as a constraint, limiting plausible interpretations. The interpreter's task is to hypothesize about the author's intent, test this hypothesis against the textual evidence, and refine it iteratively. This method, Hirsch claims, allows for a degree of objectivity, as interpretations can be adjudicated based on their coherence with the author's probable intentions. To operationalize this approach, Hirsch introduces the concept of intrinsic jura, a category that mediates between the text and the interpreter's assumptions. Intrinsic jura refers to the type of meaning the author intended to convey, shaped by conventions of form, style, and content recognizable within a specific historical and cultural milieu. For example, interpreting a sonnet requires knowledge of poetic conventions, just as understanding a legal document demands familiarity with juridical norms. By correctly identifying the intrinsic jura, the interpreter narrows the range of plausible meanings, avoiding anachronistic or contextually incongruous readings. Hirsch's emphasis on jura underscores his belief that meaning is not only tied to the author's psyche, but is also a social and historical construct, accessible through shared linguistic and cultural frameworks. Hirsch's methodology demands rigorous engagement with historical context. He advocates for philological analysis, comparative study of contemporaneous texts, and attention to the author's biography and other works. This evidentiary approach, he argues, guards against the subjective imposition of modern values or perspectives onto the text. For instance, interpreting John Milton's Paradise Lost requires understanding 17th-century theological debates, just as analyzing Kafka's The Trial necessitates familiarity with early 20th-century existential anxieties. By reconstructing the horizon of the author's historical moment, the interpreter approximates the intended meaning, even if absolute certainty remains elusive. Hirsch acknowledges that complete objectivity is unattainable, but insists that probabilistic judgments, based on available evidence, can yield valid interpretations. Critics of Hirsch's theory have raised several objections. Post-structuralist thinkers, such as Jacques Derrida and Roland Barthes, challenged the very notion of a stable, author-centered meaning, arguing that language is inherently unstable and that texts inevitably escape authorial control. Reader response theorists, including Stanley Fish, contended that meaning is constructed in the act of reading, rendering the author's intent irrelevant. Even within traditional hermeneutics, scholars like Hans Georg Gadamer emphasize the fusion of the reader's and text's horizons, positing that meaning emerges dialogically, rather than being unearthed from the past. Hirsch's reliance on authorial intent, these critics argue, neglects the dynamic, interactive nature of interpretation and underestimates the role of the reader's subjectivity. Another critique centers on the practicality of accessing authorial intent. Skeptics question whether an author's intentions can ever be fully recovered, given the historical distance and the potential for incomplete or biased evidence. Moreover, authors themselves may be unaware of their subconscious motivations, or may articulate intentions that contradict their textual output. Hirsch counters that while perfect reconstruction is impossible, interpreters can approximate intent through disciplined inquiry, much like historians reconstruct past events. He also distinguishes between voluntary intentions, what the author consciously aimed to convey, and involuntary psychological states, arguing that only the former are relevant to meaning. Despite these criticisms, Hirsch's work remains influential, particularly in fields where the stakes of interpretation are high, such as legal hermeneutics, theology, and textual editing. In legal contexts, for instance, the debate between originalism and living constitutionalism mirrors Hirsch's arguments about fixed meaning versus evolving significance. Similarly, religious scholars grappling with scriptural interpretation often engage with his ideas to navigate tensions between traditional exegesis and contemporary relevance. Hirsch's impact is also evident in education, where his later work on cultural literacy extends his belief in shared knowledge as a foundation for communication. Validity in interpretation endures not only as a defense of authorial intent, but as a provocative challenge to interpretive relativism. Hirsch's insistence on methodological rigor and his nuanced distinctions between meaning and significance offer tools for critics seeking to balance historical fidelity with interpretive creativity. While contemporary literary theory has largely moved toward more pluralistic and reader-oriented models, Hirsch's work serves as a reminder of the ethical and epistemological responsibilities inherent in interpretation. By anchoring meaning to authorial intent, he advocates for a humility that prioritizes the text's authority over the reader's predilections, a stance that continues to resonate in ongoing debates about the nature of understanding itself. In this way, Hirsch's contribution transcends its mid-century context, inviting perpetual re-engagement with the question of what it means to interpret a text validly.